Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. After the break, my first question is to Venerable Professor Vimalaratna Thera, Head of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. Venerable Thera, when we take the concept of poverty alleviation, we can't not talk about the Samurdhi program. Equally also, I'd like to take this scenario of the Colombo elite that goes into an air-conditioned coffee shop and pays 750 rupees for a cappuccino, and juxtapose that with a day-wage laborer in a village who has to work 12 hours to earn the same amount of money. So the inequality of wealth and income is so stark. It's really shocking. In a theoretical sense, can you help us come to terms with this reality?
Well, in rural areas, household income is low compared to urban areas. You can raise rural income further not only through Samurdhi programs. There should be other parallel initiatives. I am always proposing we should go to urban areas. You cannot do that immediately. It takes time. In the short run and medium run, you can do one thing to raise the household income in rural areas by opening up supplementary income sources. Again, if we take examples from President Premadasa, he did a good job. He introduced factories to rural areas. Factories to rural areas. So that income of rural people increased. They were able to find jobs while they are engaged in household management. Especially women in Sri Lanka, they do not like to come to labor force since they have culturally bound family obligations. I am not promoting that idea, but still we have to accept the ground reality. If there are job opportunities in rural sector itself, they would go for jobs when they are free, and they will earn some income. When we look at our poverty alleviation programs, you can divide those programs into two: direct poverty alleviation programs as well as indirect poverty alleviation programs. Samurdhi is direct. Declared objective is poverty reduction. It's a direct poverty reduction program. Still, you do not have targets. I haven't seen anywhere in the policy documents when we are going to stop Samurdhi. That is not there. Perhaps poverty is good opportunity for politicians to get more votes. They can give a lot of promises if you are poor. If you are an able person, you are not expecting anything from government to maintain your life. So, poverty is essential component for politicians in the country. And one more area. If we explore the history of Sri Lanka, long ago, before the arrival of Europeans, poor people used to live in the countryside. They did not have a stable source of income. Still they had 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 kids. They were essentially farmers. They were not expecting anything from the government. They had some lands. In addition to that, they had to pay different types of taxes to the government. With all that, they managed to look after themselves. What actually happened after the political independence, we have to admit that hunger was there at the political independence. We misused that. We promised to give different types of handouts for poor people to get their votes. But we did not have proper targets when we are going to end those handouts. So that now people are expecting more and more from the government. We are calling it dependency syndrome. You have to find answer to the dependency syndrome. As long as you are failing to find answer, this will continue.
Thank you very much, Venerable Thera. Professor Sirimal Aberatna, I'd like to draw reference to what the Venerable Thera said and ask you, in your opinion, what is the nexus between poverty alleviation, political will and political maneuvering, and education reforms?
Yes. Poverty alleviation, as the Venerable Sir also mentioned, it has become those programs actually they have done something, but as he mentioned, there are no targets. So you cannot have Samurdhi, you cannot be a Samurdhi recipient for generations, right? And sure. It is called poverty alleviation program, which means that the poverty should end somewhere along down the line. But it is not coming to an end, and it is continuing.
So are we, is this concept conceptually flawed? Is that what you're saying?
I think the targets are not there. Okay, we are going to support you, because we should also understand that it is supporting, or it is a remedy to relieve the symptoms of poverty, not the source of poverty.
Right.
So largely it is a symptom of poverty, and so the poor does not have enough income. It's a symptom of poverty, and so that the Samurdhi provides some cash relief or some other benefits to these households. So which means now if the term is self-explanatory, poverty alleviation, if it is the case, actually at least in one generation the Samurdhi should come to an end. But it's not happening, because it has become politicized, and it is a safety net for politicians, not for the poor. So which means actually in reality it is not the successful, it is not the strategy to end poverty. Of course it has done some, there has been some impact, and when the people receive the cash subsidies, but we have actually misused it, to my understanding, to a large extent over the years. And education, as we know, there are direct ways of addressing poverty issues as well as indirect ways. So that education I consider, as well as many other things, many other infrastructure development and providing opportunities, all these things, among them one important avenue for poor people to escape from poverty, that is education. In fact, Sri Lanka has also done among other countries in the region, especially in this particular area. Being a low-income country, Sri Lanka has maintained high education standards as well as high health standards also. Again, what I want to highlight here is also what we have achieved is we are proud of that. However, we haven't gone beyond that point to make it more appropriate, more consistent and more developed according to the modern times, so that in fact there should be education reforms also to address that issue. Why I would say that? Because it's not about the primary education or secondary education or school education. There are differences, regional differences in the quality of education at different level, and when you go along the ladder to the higher levels of education, your opportunities are very limited, very limited, and no opportunities are opening up for the poor. So these are two areas that we need to focus on in terms of future educational reforms.
So Professor, as long as a man remains poor, a politician can use him and manipulate him. So who then is the relevant stakeholder who has to put an end to this? And do you think Sri Lanka has the political will to move towards true and sincere poverty alleviation or not?
Again, we can go by emotions. If I do that, I may be politically correct, but my heart says that I am not correct in terms of my discipline, right? So if you look at the reality, in fact, there should be a political will to do that. One side is there, and the other side, and there should be an awareness among the people that this vicious cycle is not going to come to an end with our dependency syndrome in this country, so that there should be a breakthrough. And in fact, how do we provide the breakthrough? In fact, it has to be coming from the top, and there should be political will. If we provide these opportunities, and poor will improve their capacity to contribute to the economy as well as to reward from the economy. So that's how they will end their poverty in a sustainable manner, and without depending on what the politicians offer to them. But unfortunately, I would say substantial segment of our political entity, substantial number of politicians, actually they prefer not to end it in that way, knowingly or unknowingly, because they like to be accepted among the school children, among the poor people, and so they like to stay in the same manner.
During election period, political patronage is battakat and araku kala. Thank you very much, Professor Aberatna. Dr. Udan Fernando, Professor Sirimal Aberatna spoke about this dependency syndrome. There's a Chinese proverb that says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Now, this concept of empowerment, sometimes one may feel is lacking in the Sri Lankan psyche. We always tend to depend on a system, on a government to provide us with what we require. As a professional in this field of poverty alleviation, how do you view it?
Yeah, that's the quote is apt for our discussion, and I think there's a tradition of welfareist policies in Sri Lanka from the colonial times. So people are used to handouts from the government, and they believe that they are entitled. The government should provide them with the goodies. But then I think things have changed along the line, and I think it's the evolution of our economic history is not as linear as we were discussing. And one major kind of turning point in recent times, actually it's 40 years back, was the introduction of the market economy in 1977, which changed the hitherto welfare system, and actually it shook the system. I think things have changed since then. I don't say that the change has been radical and transformative, but the whole idea of the government as the sole provider of everything, to people have changed. I think that ideological shift took place in 1977 with a lot of pressures. There is a level of ambivalence on every political party on this matter because of the electoral politics. But still, the economic ideology has changed. The change took place in 1977, and people were expected to be much more entrepreneurial, taking the initiative and so on, with various degrees of success, I must say. And now if you take the current policies, the latest policy, the Vision 2025, and also the last budget, places a lot of emphasis on the enterprise, the entrepreneurial aspect of people. So I think there's also a change. I don't know whether this is realistic or not, but to respond to your question, there's also been a shift of thinking.
Okay, so in terms of the convergence of the relevant stakeholders in this poverty alleviation, rural development enterprise, do you not see a rift between certain stakeholders? For example, you have the line ministry, you have government departments, you have other organizations, you have the NGO sector, and you have the general public in the middle of it all. Do you think that all these relevant stakeholders are converging in order to provide a result to this issue, or is there duplicity in the work? How do you view this?
No, to direct answer to your question is there's a divergence, not convergence, and there's also a lot of conflict and duplication. So there are different agencies in charge of more or less the same subject.
Right.
But the fundamental problem is the lack of a overarching policy on the issue. So poverty is given to a particular ministry. For functional purposes, there should be a ministry.
Right.
That's good, and that should be the case. But poverty alleviation should also be part of the macroeconomic policy. It should be reflected well in that. So it should be delegated to a particular ministry upon formulating an overarching policy, which is not happening in the right way as we expect.
Right. So what is your suggestion for this, Dr. Fernando?
Well, not to start, Professor Sirimal Aberatna's first point was that poverty should not be taken in isolation.
Right.
I think that's a very good approach to address the issue. It should be, it's also, poverty is also a kind of a byproduct of a larger systemic kind of, problem. So the macroeconomic policy should address the bigger problem, should look at the bigger picture and understand why poverty is perpetuated and how that should be stopped. So you should look at the bigger picture rather than trying to zoom into poverty itself, which is fundamentally flawed. So the answer is to have the overarching macroeconomic policy which addresses poverty as a bigger economic kind of phenomenon.
Before opening the floor for questions from Charita and Nadeem, Dr. Fernando, what is your thought on this juxtaposition between the stark reality of the Colombo elite and the rural populace? Because the reality, the sort of inequality is rather stark. And do you think we're anywhere close to bridging the gap?
No, I think it's getting worse, and it's also it's not just a Sri Lankan phenomenon; it's also a global trend. If you go by the poverty statistics, the income-based inequalities are not reflected well in the statistics that we have. So one would argue that the inequality levels are, from an income point of view, are at a low level. But inequality is also reflected in different ways. Exclusion, marginalization, social acceptance, they're all part of different forms of inequalities. And that's rising. So what you see, the difference, the coffee shop and also the laborer in the village. Now that's one form of inequality, injustice. But it's manifested in different ways, and in global discussions, even institutions like World Bank and IMF, which took a very different position on inequality. And there was a time that they were more or less suggesting that inequality is inevitable as part of this economic system. But now they have come to the realization that inequality is harmful in the long run, and it creates more social conflict and social turmoil. So there is a shift, and their worry is not about the poor themselves, but about the bigger picture. In order to salvage the system, you should contain, at least manage inequality. So that's the latest discussions that are happening at the level of World Bank and IMF and so on. So I think we should address inequality as a priority, because it's the next challenge. Poverty itself, I told you that it's the income poverty is taking a different trend, and it's a downward kind of trend. But inequality is, as you mentioned, is the next big challenge.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Fernando. Charita, over to you.
Thank you, Sonali. My question is to Professor Abeyratne. Now, Venerable Thero mentioned that poverty could be an opportunity for politicians to exploit. Given that context, do you think we have, by giving subsidies, concessions and protectionist policies, do you think we have trapped our farming community in poverty?
Again, I would say that subsidies would not end poverty, and there are structural problems in rural poverty, especially Venerables also mentioned about it, and I also mentioned about it at the beginning, because the subsidies do not address these structural problems. For example, one of the fundamental issues in this country is the small scale farming, as he mentioned. That's why I also mentioned that we in this country, too many people are concentrated in that particular economic activity, producing too little, so that we know that production is the output is the income. So when you translate that output into income, and everybody is getting a smaller amount, so that it reflects the fundamental source of poverty. So how do we eliminate this one? Just by giving subsidies, and that's the fundamental issue. And in fact, one of the controversial, I can go by emotions again and to be politically correct, but in fact to tell you the truth, one of the challenging solutions for this is actually, it's not happening overnight, it takes time for rural people to concentrate in urban sector, and which has to be supported by the policy, and then leaving rural areas to larger farmland, as well as you can leave some of the rural villages to the forest and jungle. It's good for our elephants also. And I think this is the way to make people's effort more productive in economic activity, which will be at the end of the day translated into their higher incomes.
So what you are saying, in other words, is to gradually shift people from agriculture to more productive industrial or manufacturing.
I think that is the route that we have seen in rich countries. If you take rich countries, country in Western Europe or USA, or even in Japan and Sri Lanka has some similarities. I can also mention those. Only 1% of the total GDP coming from agriculture sector, but that 1% is much bigger than our entire GDP. But that 1% is produced by about 2 to 3% of people who are focusing on agriculture. Actually, you can call them not farming, not subsistence farming, but actually that is agribusiness. So that in Sri Lanka we have about 10 to 7, around 7% now agriculture contribution, but nearly 30% of our workforce is still in agriculture, and it should come down to 15%, 10% and 5%, and those people will have the opportunities in the other sectors, service sector and also the manufacturing sector. Also when we have the flexible labor market, flexible land markets in this country, and that will be helpful to create or to eliminate this small scale farming system. To my understanding, I think our average farm size is half a hectare to my knowledge, if I remember it correctly, half a hectare, and which is very small amount, and whereas you find hundreds of acres in other countries, and so that is one reason why they are poor, and that is one reason why they are why their bargaining power is very weak in the market also.
Reverend Professor, on the subject of agriculture and the number of people working in the agriculture sector and the output that we're getting from it, already in Sri Lanka we have one of the Sri Lanka is one of the regionally we have the highest food costs. We spend a lot of money on food as well. Is it possible to, as Professor Abeyratne said, to move a large section of these people who are working in agriculture into industry and services, while at the same time ensuring Sri Lanka's food security?
When we look at the historical experience of other countries, they started with agriculture. Later on, they turned to industrial sector. Finally, they ended up with services. If you take Japan, Japan opened her economy during the Meiji period. That was 1860, while we are cultivating coffee here. And 1870, Sri Lanka recorded the highest per capita in Asia. 1870, long ago. And Japan opened her economy 1860s. At that time, agriculture contribute nearly 80% to Japanese GDP. GDP concept was not there during those days. It came much later, just before the Second World War. Anyway, according to the current estimates, Japanese situation was that. And when it comes to the Second World War, is still nearly 50% of Japanese income came from agriculture, and people were living in agricultural area. Later on, along with the industrialization, they moved away from rural villages to urban centers. So that in case of Sri Lanka, if we want to reduce rural poverty, sustainable manner in the future, we have to develop urban centers. We cannot bring all the people to Colombo. That was the hypothetical idea I presented at the beginning. We can develop regional centers, city centers. There you will have essential facilities, not just slums and shanties. Attractive. When you go to urban centers in developed countries, you would see all the facilities are there. Big parks, forests close to urban centers, and also swimming pools, gymnasiums, all the facilities are there. You don't feel you are living in urban area. But in our urban sector, other than Colombo, if you go to urban centers recently developed, can you find parks, forests close to urban centers? And golf face is here in Colombo. Can you find Matra face in there? Or Puttalam face is there? No, we have not planned anything, so that you cannot attract rural people to even educated people to urban centers. If you want to attract them, you have to develop urban centers properly, so that you can reduce rural poverty. Similarly, Professor Sirimal correctly pointed out the role of education. That is indirect poverty reduction strategy, not the direct, not like Samruddhi, it is indirect. You have to empower people, empowering people. Unfortunately though, Sri Lankan education not contributing to reduce poverty. Why? If you look at Sri Lankan education system, you can understand simply, we are teaching to learn. We learn to teach. Learning and teaching. Learning and teaching. It is something like egg and hen puzzle. We are not educating our people to find a good job. Employability is not there. Now they are talking compulsory education up to A level. For me, it would be a big waste if you are not focusing well. If dropouts are there, say grade 8 or 9 or 10 or after O level, those dropouts students will find something to live, say masonry, carpentry, something like that. If they are going up to A level, then it would be little bit too late. And when they are coming out to schools, they cannot simply contribute to their household to bring poverty down.
Dr. Fernando.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Fernando, now if you are to move people away from the rural sector to productive areas, what are the challenges that one could face in terms of preparing them to take up more skilled, occupations? For example, now farmers during the drought or off season, most of them are in the Western province working as laborers or masons or involved in the construction industry. And most of the youth are becoming three-wheeler drivers because they think it's something more dignified than being in farming. What are the challenges in shifting this labor force from agriculture to other areas?
No, I think it's what we are discussing is a thing which has happened in history, for many centuries. the migration from rural areas to urban centers. You can take the Industrial Revolution time and so on. So so initially there are some hiccups in terms of adaptability, in terms of logistics, in terms of skills. But I think it's also the circumstances push people to adapt to new situations. Now, if you take the recent example of the drought situation and the flood situation from 2016-17, and we have had the toughest, worst droughts for the last 4 decades, they argue, and also the flood situation. It's the worst flood situation we have had in the last 16 years. So these and as a result, about 6 or 7 consecutive seasons, they couldn't. The people who were engaged in agriculture couldn't do much. So what has happened is that you see a shift of some laborers from those areas to construction sites, in Colombo and other areas. And as you know, the construction industry is growing, and the growth rate of the construction industry is larger than the overall growth rate. So so this is how, in a way, the economy is adapting, and also the labor is moving. So I don't see a huge difference, because there are certain cultural kind of constraints, but when it comes for younger labor sector, there's adaptability. I think it's already taking place, and there would be some form of instability initially, but there's also be some stability. But the problem is, even if you take the industry, the construction industry, it's not a very well organized industry in Sri Lanka. It's almost like an informal sector when it comes for employment. Now, I can't be a mason or a plumber as an employed, dignified employee. I would just come as a boss, in the morning, and get my daily wage and go home, and there's no proper place to stay. So I think even those kind of urban based industries are not very well organized. I think we have had, the construction industry have been there for a long time, but the formal growth of that industry is not happening. Like if you take Sri Lankan masons who are working in the Middle East, they have a different set of working conditions, which is very different from the masons and plumbers in Sri Lanka. So you see, so these are some of the structural problems we need to address.
Who's accountable for this failure to sort of organize and to transform the labor in the construction sector, for example? Why is it that in Sri Lanka it is this way, while elsewhere it is not?
No, I think I don't know who to blame, but the construction industry itself is complaining that they cannot have a smooth supply of labor, and they would get 50 masons for a week, and the next week they'll disappear. So there's complaint from both sides.
Do you think it's because of the need to keep labor cheap?
That could be one explanation, but in the long run, the cost is huge. Today I would have 5 masons, but next week I won't have them. So the transaction cost, the replacement cost is high. So in the short run, I would get a mason for 1,500 rupees, which is considered low. But in the long run, the delays in terms of the construction, then the damages I need to pay for my clients and so on would go up. So it's in the long run, it's a disservice, it's a loss. So I think we should take a long-term view, and also the construction industry should also look at this from a long-term perspective rather than looking things from a very short-sighted kind of way.
On the subject of policy, just after the break, in your segment just after the break, you were talking about the Vision 2025 document. Now, you were also part of the Presidential Committee on the Sustainable Sri Lanka Vision 2030 committee that was chaired by Professor Mohan Munasinghe, which was commissioned in January last year, and the report was presented in January this year. On the subject, now this was a multidisciplinary academic report. On the subject of poverty, what were the key sort of recommendations that you all had to make on poverty alleviation and sort of bringing the country towards a sustainable future?
Well, we talk about the 2030 vision document and the committee chaired by Professor Munasinghe. Poverty alleviation and also inequality were taken taken in together, which is a very good step. It's as you mentioned, it's a visionary kind of document. It's not a plan of action. So it's bigger than a broader kind of framework for long-term thinking. I think it's three concepts that were discussed under poverty alleviation. We're talking about targeting, better targeting, and a process of graduation. Another point raised by my fellow panelists. There should be a form of graduation at some point. People who needs to be helped needs to be graduated to a particular level when they are no longer poor. And there should be certain incentives for that, for graduation. Otherwise, people are happy, complacent with getting whatever amount that they are getting every month. So there should be some incentive for them to graduate from where they are to a higher position. And the third one is the mobility factor. So I think these are three principles that were guiding the discussions on poverty alleviation in the Vision 2030 document that you were talking about. So it's graduation, targeting, and mobility.
Venerable Thero, I have a question for you. The latest National Household Income and Expenditure Survey by the Department of Census and Statistics revealed that household income has been growing steadily, so has expenditure, and the gap between these two is narrowing, right? And also it says that almost 60% of Sri Lankan households are in debt. What is the socio-economic fallout from this scenario?
Well, when you look at household income and expenditure survey, you would see a certain consumption pattern simply we cannot accept to our income. Household management knowledge is not up to the expected level. You have to understand the limit of your expenditure. When I look at household income and expenditure surveys, for example, average household size in Sri Lanka now a little less than 4, average size of the household. When it comes to consumption, number one is rice. Rice expenditure is at the top. And when you look at the next is condiments. We are consuming huge condiments in Sri Lanka. Spices, red onions, like that. So large amount of money you are spending for condiments. And again, when you look at the structure, you would find average monthly household consumption of sugar, 4 kilos. 4 kilos. So that is only food consumption. Again, when we look at the food ratio concept is also there. Percentage of your expenditure, food expenditure as percentage as a total expenditure of food expenses. Again, in Sri Lanka is high. It will go down along with the rising income. Thereafter, your income will shift from food consumption to consumer durables. Now, what is happening in the countryside and even in estate sector, urban sector, even among poor people, rather than satisfying their essential nutritional requirements, most of the time they are going after unmanageable luxurious items, unmanageable. And social competition is there, big social competition is there. Say for example, you are buying maybe big television sets, television receivers, motorcycles, three-wheelers, even though you cannot manage because of this social competition. So that indebtedness is part of that. You cannot come out the indebtedness. And also you cannot maintain the minimum nutritional level since your minimum income is being spent for we it is unnecessary, but for them it is necessary.
Professor Abeyratne, just one quick question that received from a viewer actually. Do you believe that we need to be taking jobs to the rural sector, or do you think that we should be attracting people from the rural sector into urban areas to better jobs?
I think we should attract people from rural areas to the urban centers, and that is the way forward, and that's how the development takes place also. And for that, the rural sector needs to undergo certain structural changes, and in fact to put it in a very blunt way, and some people say that rural sector, the people in the agriculture sector, they are nailed down to the same poverty vicious cycle remaining in the rural sector, so that they cannot, or they are not given incentives to move out, but they have been given incentives to remain there. In fact, that is one thing, and then the urban sector should also be attractive to them to enjoy their life and to have their residence in the urban sector, as well as then there should be opportunities, particularly in manufacturing and services sectors, for them to contribute to the economy. So in that way, I think we can maintain a better balance.
Dr. Fernando, now for producers in Sri Lanka, because our market is so small, compared with what other regional countries have done, do you think it's worth forcing them to compete with products coming in so that they become competitive in the global market rather than focusing only on producing for the Sri Lankan market?
Yeah, I think it's as I mentioned before, till 1977 it was an inward looking economic policy that we had, and after 1977 that way of looking at the economy or the economic policy changed. And I would argue that it's since then we have taken a particular trajectory which is outward looking, competitive and market economic policy. At a rhetorical level, we may have heard different messages, but in essence it has been a consistent kind of trajectory, evolution, and competitiveness and also being part of the global system is very much part of the market economy that I'm talking about. So whether we like it or not, we are part of that game now. I'm not saying that it's good, and you may have seen certain industries, certain sectors dying or not being able to maintain at a feasible level because of the competitive nature of products. When certain things that were produced in Sri Lanka are no longer produced because you can import the same product or sometimes the service for a cheaper price. So I think but certain commodities, certain services are regulated and protected. And there's debate whether this should be completely liberalized or not. So that's the debate, and then the debate is also not just a economic debate, it's also a political debate, and the electoral politics, the dynamics also creep into this debate. So it's not, you cannot delineate, you cannot identify it as a kind of a pure economic kind of debate and argument and then find a way out. So it's a mixed bag, and I see a certain level of ambivalence on the part of the political parties on this sector. To dwell on some of the points that my fellow panelists were making, although the rural sector and the agriculture sector particularly needs to go through certain policy reforms, structural changes from an electoral or a voter point of view. It's also a kind of a holy cow, if I may use that term. And the politicians are very cautious to touch that, because it's also a kind of there is also a social, cultural aspect to it, which the politicians, the electoral systems, the patronage systems, they are all part of it. So I see a kind of a tussle between the kind of the ideal situation, the economists push towards the eventuality that Professor Abeyratne is talking about, and also the political will. So it kind of swings from one end to the other, and oftentimes it's things just are hanging, and concrete policies are not formulated as a result, or at least they are not enforced. You only have the policy.
Dr. Udan Fernando, thank you very much. We must go in for a short commercial break. We'll be back with the final round. What a fantastic conversation it has been. We're in conversation with Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, Professor Vimala Ratanathera, and Dr. Udan Fernando. My final question in this round is to Venerable Professor Vimala Ratanathera. Successive governments have failed to provide a sustainable solution to this issue of poverty alleviation to ensure a holistic response to rural development. Going forward, how must we best align ourselves in order to find a solution to this?
Well, when we look at this question, you cannot blame only to the successive governments. Rural people should also take a part of the responsibility. Say for example, when you look at rural farmlands, most of the time those farmlands have not fully exploited. If you exploit them properly, you can generate some income either in money or in kind. When you look at rural farmlands, say for example rural gardens and urban small gardens, you can grow fruits, vegetable and some other essential items, so that rather than looking for income from outside, you can save some money. You can raise the nutritional level of your household. In that way, I can say they have also responsibility. At the same time, government and other agencies look at the holistic approach, not one-sided, one aspect of the issue. And here again, you can look at direct poverty alleviation programs as well as indirect poverty alleviation programs.
Thank you very much, Swamin Wahansa. My next question is to Professor Sirimal Abeyratne of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. Professor, sometimes in Sri Lanka we see a disempowered citizenry, sometimes driven by poverty and helplessness. We see people driven to prostitution, other modern forms of slavery, working in garment sectors, plantation sectors, working as migrant workers under deplorable conditions, as we mentioned before. So poverty is a vicious cycle. whom do we hold accountable at the end of the day? Is it the local government agencies? Is it the central government? Is it the line ministry? Is it the law enforcement agencies? Who do we hold accountable at the end of the day?
I would take a holistic approach to answer your question. When we take it, actually we don't blame any particular individual party for this, and we all have to take the responsibility. When I put it in the context, and we say that a country develop on the basis of two things. One is the policies and other one is the institutions. Institutions means the way that we behave as individuals, as well as we belong to certain groups, our group behavior. So these two things are important to make the changes. In fact, throughout our experience in the past, we have seen certain challenges that we have faced with our environment, with our institutions, so that it is not just the politicians, it is not just the government, it is not just the democracy or elections, and in fact as citizens we are also responsible for that, all these things. In fact, the outcome that you are talking about is the product of all these environmental factors. Therefore, I think the poverty alleviation programs, you can't take it in isolation. That was my main theme, and you need to take it as a product of our investment drive and achieving higher growth and employment in Sri Lanka in the future.
Thank you, Professor Sirimal Aberatna, for that. My final question for tonight is to Dr. Udan Fernando, Executive Director of SEPA. Through our GUM at the Rural Development Program, Dr. Fernando, something that we saw was the manner in which villagers suffer, for example, due to a lack of clean drinking water, due to chronic kidney ailment, wild elephant attacks, broken down roads, bridges. And through Gammada, something that we saw was the manner in which the private sector and the general public converged to bring in funding in order to help these villagers. So similarly, the Bali process that I mentioned, where the private sector and state leaders got together, converged in order to resolve these issues. So poverty alleviation and the role of the private sector on the one hand and the citizenry on the other. That's my final question to you.
Yeah, I'm glad that you raised this question. I think the role of the private sector in terms of poverty alleviation is very important, because private sector is big in Sri Lanka. It's the driver of growth. My understanding is that the private sector should not look at poverty as a charitable kind of outlet. Rather, they should see poverty as an overall structural problem, and the response to poverty on the part of the private sector should be part and parcel of their own conduct. It's not a once a year charitable activity that they would do, or what they would do under what are called corporate social responsibility, CSR projects. Poverty is not a project. I think it's the private sector should look at the bigger social problems and then adapt themselves to those conditions. So be responsible in their own business ventures, better taxpayers, they offer better employment contracts for people and better working conditions. I think these are durable solutions to the issue rather than taking a charitable approach. So I would urge that the private sector and also the individuals would take that kind of the structural approach, the mainstream approach, rather than taking poverty as an ad hoc issue. So that's my plea to the private sector.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Udan Fernando. On that note, we wrap up this edition of Face the Nation. For joining us on this edition, I'd like to thank Venerable Professor Vimala Ratanathera, Head of the Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. Thank you for joining us. Also, Professor Sirimal Aberatna, Department of Economics at the University of Colombo. And finally, Dr. Udan Fernando, Executive Director of SEPA. The journalists tonight, Charitha Fernando and Nadeem Majid, thank you so much, guys. Now, in 2005, Nelson Mandela, in his famous speech, Make Poverty History, called on world leaders to do this. And he says, massive poverty and obscene inequality are such terrible scourges of our times, times in which the world boasts breathtaking advances in science, technology, industry and wealth accumulation, that they have to rank alongside slavery and apartheid as social evils. Remember, you too are a part of the solution. Good night.